Okay, so today we're going to be talking about how we transitioned our dissection course into a virtual experience in response to COVID-19. So typically we run a 10-week interprofessional dissection course in the winter term, and we recruit students, first-year students, from a variety of different professional programs. So this includes occupational therapy, physiotherapy, physician's assistants, the undergraduate medical program, midwifery, speech language pathology, and nursing. I swear I'm only going to say that once. And these students actually enter into a lottery system because the course is quite popular, and they're dispersed into an interprofessional group, and they work with that group throughout the course of the term. So when they complete the course, they receive a mastery level IPE credit, and we're actually the only academic mastery level credit available to McMaster students. So as we all know, by the end of March of 2020, COVID was in full swing. Thankfully, our 2020 cohort was able to get through the 10 weeks unscathed. But as the summer went on, we quickly realized that creating an in-person version in 2021 would just not be possible, which is sort of nerve-wracking for us. We've run the course for 13 years. It's well known and well applied for by those professional programs. And so we were concerned about what that would look like as a virtual event. So we sort of put our heads together and tried to come up with something for them to do in 2021. So before we talk about changes, I just want to explain how the course used to run. So as I mentioned, it's 10 weeks and it's 3 hours every week, typically in the evenings, just when those students are most available. And there's three sort of major elements to the course. So we have presentations at the beginning where students learn about briefly the anatomy that they're going to be looking at for the rest of the evening, as well as the scope of practice of one of the 7 professions. Then they break out into interprofessional groups. These groups are predetermined, and they're led by what we like to call coordinators. So coordinators are upper year students who've previously taken the course, who have now returned to help lead a new group through the course. So they break out into those groups and discuss a case study. And then with that same group, they move into a cadaveric dissection relevant to the anatomy that they've learned that week. So just to show what that looks like with a time frame, we spend about 20 minutes doing presentations, and the presentations are given by those coordinator students. In the presentation portion, students are encouraged to ask questions. They may not have heard about midwifery or speech language pathology scope before, so they're encouraged to ask questions here. Then they move into those IP groups for case studies, always relevant to the anatomy that they've learned, and students are encouraged here to implement their profession's scope into the case. So how might a midwife approach this particular case? Then we spend a lot of time, 2 hours, typically in dissection. The reason that we spend so much time in dissection is because, one, it takes a long time, but the first few weeks, students are very apprehensive about dissection. They're not comfortable with cadaveric material. They probably never used a scalpel before. And so we allot a large amount of time into that portion of the class. So how did we change things? Obviously, we couldn't meet in person. So we moved everything onto Microsoft Teams. We liked Teams because we could share files with one another, and they would be accessible in future weeks. We were comfortable with it, and we knew that students wouldn't have problems accessing it because McMaster has a subscription to it. We also liked that there were private channels for the breakout groups, so students could share things in that group without everyone else in the course seeing what was going on there. We also condensed our content down a lot. We thought that 10 weeks of virtual dissection would be a lot, and we also decreased the amount of time each week. So really the main reason for this was the dissection aspect. We were no longer dissecting in person, and rather than dissecting in person, we recorded a full body dissection in advance. So myself and Andrew, those 2 little squares, heads that you see in the square below, we dissected a full body and recorded it in advance. Then we had our movie magic guide, Josh, come in and condense those videos down into 20, 30-minute videos. So we went from hours of content into short little sort of snippets. And to keep things as interactive as possible, we decided to voice over the videos live to make it a little bit more like things were happening in real time. So this is what the class looks like virtually. We spend a little bit more time doing scope of practice and anatomy presentations just because the weeks have been condensed here. So we need to allocate slightly more time to get through all of those scope of practice presentations. And then they break off into their groups, those private channels and teams, and discuss a case study that's relevant to the anatomy. And then they come back to the main room and watch and participate in the virtual dissection. So I always like to give people a good idea of what that looks like. So if I click on the link here, we should be able to watch a little snippet. You'll notice as I start to cut through the patellar ligament, the tibia will drop away as we cut through that ligament. So you can see how much strength that structure has in the joint. So again, just reflecting this back, and you can see once we open up that joint space, the femoral condyles should be quite noticeable, and there's a large amount of fat here in that joint space. As we reflect that patellar ligament and patella back, we can see the inferior surface of the patella as well.
So right now we can see that inferior surface of the patella, and we're just cutting away that fat pad. So that's normal to see that much fat deep to the patella. And right now you can just see that we're highlighting the surface of the femoral condyle. So you see that there's quite a large surface area there. And you can also see that we're trying to demonstrate that there's quite a bit of synovial fluid there as well. So that's like motor oil within a joint or motor oil within the engine that lubricates that joint or lubricates an engine. So we're just cutting away the majority of that fat pad now. And I see we actually have a question. So I'm just going to pause the video really quick. Yeah, go ahead.
Great, thank you. I'm just wondering if there are any indicators there of the presence of osteoarthritis?
Great question. So right now you can actually see we're pointing out.
So hopefully that helps give you a good idea of what we mean by voice over live and how things were a little bit more interactive with the students in this case. So just a little side-by-side comparison of those two versions of the course. So obviously we're dealing with a big time difference here. The in-person version, we're looking at 30 hours in class compared to the virtual version, which is only 8 hours in class. We wanted to eliminate sort of that virtual fatigue. Slight different amounts in presentation time. The reason that we have slightly more presentation time in the virtual is, again, to just accommodate that extra scope of practice presentation. Case studies remain the same. So they're breaking out into their groups. They're discussing with their interprofessional group the clinical cases for the week. And really the big difference between the versions of the course is in the dissection portion. So you can see in the in-person version, they're moving with that group into dissection. They're dissecting their own body. They're with that group for 2.5 hours, roughly every week. Whereas in the virtual version, we're only spending 40 minutes in dissection, and that's happening as one large group. So we were really curious about what the differences were between the two groups.
As Jasmine was saying, with these significant changes, we wanted to know what was the impact, or if it has any impact in the IPE outcomes of the course. We recruited students from the 2021 cohort to conduct this assessment. And as you can see, the cohort consisted in 30 students. They were mainly women from a variety of programs, as Jasmine spoke earlier. Students have little experience with IPE, with only 7 reporting exposure to IPE. Then we asked them before and after the course to fill in the 2 IPE questionnaires. And these questions have been validated and used widely to assess IPE competencies. And those were, and namely to assess the readiness for interprofessional learning and the perceptions about interprofessional education. So the first one is the readiness for interprofessional learning scale, or the ripples. And very quickly, it is composed of 19 items, and it ranges from 19 low readiness to 95. eye readiness to interprofessional learning, and it has 4 subscales. Then the second one is the interdisciplinary education perception scale, or the IEPS. It has 12 items, so it is slightly quicker to fill. It ranges from 12 to 72, indicating low and higher perception, respectively, and it has subdivided in 3 scales. So from those 30 students that enrolled, actually, we only have 23 and 26 that answered the ripples and the IEPS pre and post course. And as we can observe here in the graph on your left, we had a statistically significant increase in the score on the ripples, which is the readiness for interprofessional learning. And if we look at the table, we have this increase mainly in the roles and responsibilities subscale of this score. Now, if we look at the right, in the perception of interprofessional learning, we didn't have any statistically significant differences from pre to post course. So another thing that we were interested about was to know if the virtual environment affected the IP outcomes any differently than the in-person environment affected. And because we have been collecting the ripples and IP scored as outcomes for the course for many years now, we were able to retrospectively compare the IP outcomes between the in-person cohort of 2020 and the virtual cohort in 2021. Now, considering that these are convenience samples, we were not able to match the group, and there was in fact a difference in age between the cohorts, with the 2020 cohort being slightly older than the 2021 cohort. But overall, there was no statistically significant differences between the composition of the cohorts or the previous IPE experiences. Now, comparing the differences in the readiness for and perception about interprofessional learning pre and post the course between the 2 cohorts, what we can see basically here represented is neither for the ripples or for the IPES, there was statistically differences between the groups. And there was also no differences between the groups in the subscales of these, in the subscores of these scales. So this suggests us that in terms of the IP outcomes, there was no differences in implementing the course virtually or in person. So concluding, what we wanted to transmit to you today, and hopefully we were able to do so independently of the troubles in the connection, was that, as Jas said in the beginning, we were very nervous when starting the course, preparing everything in the middle of the pandemic, but it seems that it worked. So we have prepared the course ahead. All the dissections have to have been captured ahead. The lab material has to be created, the lottery of the students. So everything was prepared ahead. But once these videos have been recorded and edited, we will be able to use them in the future, which is really good because it will save us a lot of time and also a lot of resources in the future. We were able to use the MS Teams with no problem. Students, as Jas said, liked using it. They liked that they were able to have access to the material in the future. We received actually quite good feedback. We have implemented some open-ended questions that we are now analyzing in more detail. But for the overall, it seems that the students liked the course. And we actually had some improvement in the interprofessional learning in this 2021 course, which was awesome. And if we look back in the in-person cohorts, when we compared the IP outcomes between these 2 cohorts, we did not have any statistically differences. So for future, we are hoping that we can use this to expand these experiences. And we are hoping that we can implement this even internationally. Now, these are some references that we have been published with this course. So if you are interested in IP and in anatomy, you can take a look at this using the QR codes. I think this is it for today. Thank you for staying with us.